Some of you have heard Dr. Darrel Ray speak before. You know he's very funny, as well as he's entertaining and knowledgeable, and it's going to be a great talk. So please put your hands together for what I think is the modern-day Kinsey. Dr. Darrel Ray, please come up.
This on too soon, I guess. Let me get this up and running. I'm just delighted to see you're having Shelley Siegel come. If there are angels, she is one of them. I love that gal, and she has invited me to speak in Melbourne when I'm in Melbourne next. Thank you. When I'm in Melbourne in February, I guess it is. I'm going there. Okay. Well, to begin with, we have to properly initiate this meeting. How many of you are Pastafarians in here? Okay, so you guys, the rest of you can keep your eyes open. The Pastafarians need to bow their heads and close their eyes. And I'm going to say a prayer here. Dear Flying Spaghetti Monster, we thank you for giving us sex and sexuality, whether homo or heterosexual, bi or trans, for not making us like those uptight Christians, Muslims, Mormons, and Baptists. We thank you for wonderful masturbatory fantasies and for the pornography upon which they're often based. FSM, we ask that you grant us sex partners, lovers, wives, and husbands that know where our G-spot, clitoris, and the sweet spot on our penis is. Grant us long, loving foreplay with deep, wet kisses, followed by huge orgasms and loving cuddles after. Grant us the courage and wisdom to communicate openly and honestly with our partners, to give them more pleasure than we receive, for we know it is far better to give than to receive. Your noodliness, we do not need 72 virgins. In fact, we ask that you send us no virgins, for we don't want to have to train them. Unless, of course, they're very willing to be trained. We especially plead today that you not send us any repressed Christian virgins, male or female, for they will only feel guilty and cause great problems with their abstinence-only training. Your Posthumous, we ask that you give us the wisdom to understand and appreciate our partner's kinks, or lack thereof. Whether foot worship or spanking, ropes or talking dirty, help us to appreciate their full sexuality and lead us not into temptation and judgment and scorn for others when their sexual preferences are not ours. We do ask in the name of Raman for retribution, shame, and scorn for pedophile priests, hypocritical ministers sleeping with the choir director, and gay-bashing closeted ministers, etc. Oh, Spaghetti-O. We ask that you send condoms and birth control in abundance, and your many blessings on the dedicated workers at the Trojan Condom Factory and Planned Parenthood. In the name of Dan Savage and Greta Christina, we pray, for they are the true gods and goddesses of this world. Do I hear a ramen? Right. All right, there we go. Now, I am from Kansas, and if you don't know, Kansas is where the Flying Spaghetti Monster first revealed himself to the world at the Kansas State School Board meetings. You know the story about the FSM, and if you don't, you need to learn about it. All right, well, let's get in here and learn about sex and God. I was here about 2 years ago to talk about the God virus. Gosh, we had a crowd like this last time, so this is great. And evidently, you guys all like sex, so you're back for a second time. But specifically, we're going to talk about Chapter 16, and Chapter 16 is only overview of our research. So if you buy the book, you're not going to get the full report there. You can buy the report out there for $5, just the printing cost, or you can download it for free at ipcpress.com. So the whole thing, everything I'm talking about here and far more is contained in the free download online. So I want to say thanks to Mark and Bobby and Norman, and probably didn't get all the names up, and Mike. Where's Mike at? Yeah, oh, there he is right there. And, all the other people that helped get this thing organized. I see Bruce, well, I can't see Bruce back there, but Bruce is a friend of mine. And I want to establish my credentials here. I am a high priest in the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. And this is I am the, with a capital T, This is my rod, and it's an exact replica of what's underneath that gown. Just, I will not. So I thought we'd get off to the right start. This is the original artwork before the Catholic Church censored it, by the way. So today we're going to look at an overview of our research, Amanda Brown and I. And I'm going to begin by asking, how many of you masturbate? I do. All right. Looks like only a few liars in this group. All right. Can you imagine asking that in a Catholic church? In a Baptist service? How about a Mormon church or a Muslim mosque? You can't imagine asking that question. And if you did ask a bunch of Baptists, do you masturbate? There would be no hands go up. It'd be like that. They're all lying. They're lying their heads off, aren't they? Because we know most. Well, I studied with the great psychotherapist Albert Ellis back in the 70s and 80s. And he had a famous saying. He said 97% of men admit to masturbating, the other 3% are lying. Well, it's kind of the same thing for women. About 80% of women masturbate and 10% are lying. There's probably some proportion of women that don't or never have masturbated, but it's a very high, statistically high activity that all of us humans engage in. However, religions are just so consumed with what you do with your own body. I mean, you're not even screwing anybody else. You're just playing with yourself. But here's what Mark Driscoll, one of our megachurch ministers up in Seattle, says about masturbation. Masturbation can be a form of homosexuality because it is a sexual act that does not involve a woman. Notice, gals, you get off scot-free here. If a man were to masturbate while engaged in other forms of sexual intimacy with his wife, then he would not be doing it in a homosexual way. However, any man who does so without his wife in the room is bordering on homosexual activity, particularly if he's watching himself in the mirror and being turned on by his own male body. What the fuck? I never thought about that. I wonder where he got that idea from. Just saying. So the religions are so concerned with all this, and I wanted to understand that. I've been so interested since I was 12 years old in sex. And when I went to seminary at the ripe old age of 22, 23, 24, and I'm horny as hell, and they're talking about all the things you can't do in sex. I'm married, by the way, to a very religious woman, and you know, that's a problem too in many cases. So that got me even more interested in why sex and religion seem to cross. But it took me many years, obviously, later before I got to ask other questions. How many of you believe in premarital sex or have it? Okay, looks like virtually everybody in here. Imagine asking that question in a Catholic church or a Baptist or an abstinence-only meeting. Yeah, right. Does your God watch you while you're having sex? Do you realize if you're a Christian, you have a threesome with Jesus every time you get in bed with your wife or husband? So, are you guilty? Do you still, even if you're an atheist, do you still feel guilt around normal sexual behavior in some cases? And if you do, that's evidence that we are still infected with religious ideas about sexuality. You're still infected with the God virus, so to speak. So what we can establish, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is religionists live a lie. They pretend like they don't masturbate. They claim they didn't have premarital sex. They pretend like they don't use pornography. And where's the highest use of pornography in the United States? Utah. What's number 2? Mississippi. Mississippi's number 2. And they condemn others for what we know damn good and well they're doing themselves. So look at the amount of self-deception, the amount of lying that's going on in any of the major religions communities. Now, there are exceptions, and we'll come back and look at that, but they're really, really rare. So atheists don't seem to have these problems. In general, we're less guilty, less hung up around sex and sexuality. So what Amanda and I wanted to do, Amanda is an undergraduate at University of Kansas, just 20 or 30 miles from where I live, and she and I hooked up, not in a sexual way, just hooked up, to do this research last year. And we're trying to understand what happens to people and what happens to their sex lives when they leave religion. Now, nobody had ever bothered to ask this question before. But it seems like an obvious question to me. But when I got in and looked at the research, nobody had ever looked at it before. So we figured out a way to do it. We also wanted to figure, how many of you have read The God Virus? Oh, cool. Okay, got several people in here who read it. Well, in The God Virus, you remember I talk about the guilt cycle. I'm going to come back and talk about that a little bit more today. But we wanted to put an empirical test to the guilt cycle and see if we actually get evidence in our research for how it's actually working. I'm going to put my vibrator down here for now. All right, so we put this together, and we advertised it through a bunch of atheist and community bloggers, Greta Christina, P.Z. Myers, Jen McCrite. A lot of people put it up. American Atheist, Dave Silverman helped us get the word out. So we got the word out. We had hoped we would get 1,000 responses in a month's time. And I put the darn thing up on a Monday morning. I woke up Tuesday morning, and the whole thing had blown up. We had like 4,000 responses already. I'm thinking, oh shit, a virus has got in here. Something's wrong. Well, nothing was wrong. People were just interested. So then Amanda said, well, did you remember to send this to P.Z. Myers? I said, no, I didn't. I didn't remember to send it to him. So I sent it to P.Z. Myers. And about 3 days later, it blows up to 10,000. So don't give something to PZ. He'll really go. So what we ended up with was 14,560 people participating in our survey. Almost exactly 10,000 completed the entire survey, and it was 69 questions long. And yes, that was an accident. We did not do that on purpose. Amanda called me up Sunday night before you put it up, and she said, do you realize, well, you know, we started off with 100 questions or something when we added and subtracted and modified. So I kind of lost track, and she called me up and said, do you realize we have 69 questions in this thing? No, but it's perfectly appropriate. Let's go for it. I'm not changing that. When so then we did the research. We pulled in all the data. It took us about 4 months to analyze the data. It was a tremendous amount of data. We're still analyzing the data, by the way. But that the initial report we came out with in the middle of last year. And then Greta Christina, bless her soul, she wrote a very good article reviewing the research. And she was critical. I like Greta because she doesn't bullshit people. And she found the weak spots in our research. And it has weak spots. There's no such thing as perfect research. But when she did that, the Daily Mail picked it up, the New York Post picked it up, Los Angeles Times. I mean, it was everywhere. I was getting phone calls from Pretoria, South Africa, and emails from Chile. It was just amazing. We even got in Playboy magazine. A friend of mine called me up. I'd been in Europe for a month. I get back the next day. He calls me and says, do you realize you're in Playboy magazine? I said, no. Do I have my clothes on? So we were really impressed that of course, it's only about a 3-inch piece. Not much bigger than that, but it's only about 3 inches inside of the Playboy. So today what we're going to do is we're going to look at 6 hypotheses. I'm going to go over the hypotheses. We're not going to have time to go over all this. You'll have to download the report and look at it. First of all, religion's use of sexual guilt is measurably greater in conservative religions than in less liberal ones. Now, hypothesis number 2. People feel the sexual guilt taught by their religion, but sexual behavior shows no difference from those with less guilt. Number 3, religiously conservative parents are less effective at teaching their children about sex than more secular parents. 4, children raised in highly religious homes receive poorer sexual education. 5, leaving religion has a positive impact on sexual satisfaction. And 6, religion has continuing negative consequences on individuals after they leave. Now, some of the reasons we put these hypotheses together was based on other research. We've seen what other research came up with in like the ERIS survey or some of the Gallup sex survey stuff. And we thought, well, let's look at what secularists say, because none of those are looking at secularists. They're doing other things like random sampling of the general population. We got a ton of information about the people. Even though 10,000 actually completed it, a surprising number of the 14,000 got quite a bit ways through it. I had people say, well, I tried to do the whole thing, but it knocked me off, or my browser went dead, or I left it up overnight and couldn't get back in, or something like that. There's always something happens there. But we asked tons and tons of questions about, like, what religion were you raised in, and you know, what's your gender, or what's your sexual preferences, lots and lots of things like that. So we have a ton of information about these people. You can imagine with 69 questions. So we asked them, what religion were you before you became non-religious? 100% of our sample is non-religious. We didn't want to hear from Catholics or Baptists. We only wanted non-religious people. So we're only dealing 80% of them describe themselves as atheists, for example. So we can see down here that Catholics are 19.7% of current atheists. They were formerly Catholic. That is almost exactly what the Catholic population is in the general population. It's around 22% are Catholics. Christian non-denominational, we had 14.4% Christian non-denominational. That's interesting because they only make up 8% of the general population. So in other words, atheists, non-denominational, are more represented among atheists than they should be. That tells us something interesting. They're a gateway religion. They're a gateway religion. If you go through Christian non-denominational, you're much more likely to become an atheist than if you go through Catholics or something else. 14.3% of our sample said they'd been atheists their whole life. And we defined atheism for their whole life as if they were atheists they claimed to be atheists by 14 years of age, then we just counted them as lifelong atheists. So this is actually kind of a baseline for us, this 14.3%. Those are people who weren't very effectively infected with the religious ideas. So we can kind of bounce off of them some stuff, and we do that. Of course, we got a lot of others, Lutheran, Methodist, Episcopalian, Baptist, and so forth. And, we got a small sampling of some, like Wicca and Pagan, Jehovah's Witnesses, so forth. So that's the rough breakdown. 80%, almost on the money, 80% of our population said they were atheists. 1,210 said nothing. They didn't tell us what they were. 820 agnostic, humanists, and so forth. So you can see the breakdown. And now we're going to look at the guilt cycle that I talk about in God Virus and help understand that. So then we can understand how our research reveals the guilt cycle in action. Now the guilt cycle is a simple concept. You're a kid. Your mom says, don't put your hand in the cookie jar before a meal. Yes, Mama won't do that. But you love cookies. You're hungry. So you sneak a cookie out. Your mom catches you and she slaps your hand. Says, don't do that again. So you say, okay, I won't do that again. A few days later, you're hungry. Cookie sure tasted good. Mom's not looking this time. So you put your hand in, you get a cookie. The cookie tastes so good. Except you get a little twinge inside yourself, and we call that twinge guilt. It's cognitive dissonance in psychological terms. Here's the rule Mom told me about. Here's my behavior. The dissonance between those two is expressed in the form of guilt. So that's the guilt cycle. Tension, sure tastes good. Behavior, eat the cookie. Guilt, the result of the contrast between Mom's rule and my behavior. In religion, though, you have to be taught what to be guilty of. Your mom had to teach you about the cookie thing. You wouldn't feel guilty about eating cookies if she hadn't taught you that's a wrong thing to do. You should feel guilty about it. Religion comes along and says, yeah, we can help you too, just like your mom did. You should do as God commands. And God commands all sorts of things around food for some religions, and certainly around sex and other things. And once you do it, you're going to have to come back to get forgiveness. You have to come back to us to get forgiveness. And then you do it again, and then the process starts all over again. In other words, you're sucked in. You're trapped in the guilt cycle. Here's the way the guilt cycle works with respect to religion. Remember our little circle, tension, behavior, guilt. Tension, behavior, guilt. Just goes around the circle. Well, religion comes along and says, let's teach you what to be guilty of. First of all, don't touch yourself. We were talking over here about, I've got a former Mormon, recovering Mormon over here. We'll come back and talk about Mormons. They're fun to talk about. In my book, Sex and God, a whole chapter in there called Don't Tamper with the Factory. Now, can anybody imagine what that's talking about? I couldn't. But every 12-year-old, and I've got it right over here, every 12-year-old Mormon gets a Don't Tamper with a Factory pamphlet. And it's 3 pages long and never uses the word sex, never uses the word intercourse, never uses the word masturbation once. And that's what it's about. It's about masturbation. Don't tamper with the factory. So the Mormons are trying to teach you what to be guilty of. Don't touch yourself. Do the girls get that? Only the guys.
They get it now.
They get it now. Oh, they finally figured out girls masturbate too. Joseph Smith didn't know that. He had 38 wives that couldn't figure that one out. Poor women. Somebody'd have to masturbate. I'm sure of that with only one husband. So now you have to come back to your particular religion to get forgiveness. Relief. I confess to my priest. He says, do 50 Hail Marys and I'm forgiven. And I leave. But the tension starts up again. We have an ex-Catholic priest in one of our recovering from religion groups. And he went through 8 years of seminary. He tells a story that he could go about 30 days without masturbating. And then he'd jack off. He said, oh no, I'm guilty. I've got to go confess my sin. So he'd go have to find a priest who probably masturbated that day too, and confess to the priest. Then he'd get relief. And it worked for about 30 days, and then he'd go through it again. Well, towards the end of his seminary training, he was at a zoo, and he saw chimpanzees masturbating. And he thought, this is back in Pope Paul's day, he thought, well, the Pope believes in evolution. Those guys are masturbating. What's wrong with me masturbating? He said that was the first step towards him becoming an atheist. Watching chimps masturbate. Now what you can see here is the guilt cycle brings you back to a specific religion. Mormons learn their religious guilt around Mormon training. How many Mormons go confess their sins to Catholic priests? How many Catholic priests confess their sins to Baptist ministers? How many Baptists confess their sins to Muslim imams? It doesn't happen. What the guilt cycle does, it's the best con game I've ever found psychologically. It forces you to come back to the religion you learned the guilt from. Perfect cycle. And it keeps you coming back. The more guilty you feel about something, the more you're going to come back to that particular religion. And that's what we wanted to test in our research. So, I'm going to start this off by reading a quote from Butch Hancock. I've got that all in my book, The God Virus. And Butch Hancock is a country music songwriter from Texas. But here's what Butch says. Life in Lubbock, Texas taught me two things. One, that God loves you and you're going to burn in hell. The other is that sex is the most awful, dirty thing on the face of the earth and you should save it for someone you love. I love that quote. So let's find out about guilt and the guilt cycle. Is there a difference in how different religions use the guilt cycle? If the guilt cycle is in fact, if it's in fact a real thing, then we should be able to measure it, and we should be able to see differences by religion and how much they use guilt. Because some religions are really consumed with this guilt thing, and people like the Unitarians, I don't think any of them are guilty. They have orgies Sunday afternoon. And we'll see about that. But so here's what we ask. How would you rate what you were taught? How guilty you felt about sex and its implications on yourself. A 1, no guilt at all. A 10, lots and lots of guilt. Now we also know what denomination you were raised in, what religion you were raised up in. So we can now say, how guilty were you based upon the religion you were raised in? And here's what we found. I'm going to go back and I want you to guess. What's the most guilty religion? Catholic. How many say Catholic? All right, you're wrong. The number one religion is Mormonism. They get the cake. How many ex-Mormons have we got in here? Oh, we do? Oh, yeah. Okay, you can attest to this. But right behind them are the JWs. Where's our JW? Jehovah's Witnesses. All right, I knew I had a few of those. And then we got Pentecostal, Seventh-day Adventists. You'll look here. Those four are really, definitely, clearly higher than all the others. Do you think that looks like a cult? Yeah. Of course, I think all religions are cults, but these are special cults. They're much more guilt focused. Now, that's not to say the Baptists aren't trying their best. The Southern Baptists, Mennonites, Church of Christ, Islam. Islam I'm very suspicious about because we only got about 110 Muslims, and they were literally from all over. And they've been raised, I think a lot of them have been raised in very secular homes to begin with. So I don't put a lot of faith in that. If we had been able to give a survey in Saudi Arabia, but they don't have any atheists in Saudi Arabia, so we don't get that. And by the way, 80% of our sample was from the United States. 20% came from outside the United States. We were concerned about that because we were thinking, well, maybe the internationals will in some way influence our research. And so we did some separate analysis, and what we found was, yeah, they wash it out. They're much more liberal outside the United States around sexuality than the ones inside the United States. So had we subtracted the internationals out of this, it would have been even worse. much more guilt. Not much more, because it's 20% contributing, but it would have been more. But you'll notice the fastest growing religions are the ones that are using sex so much. I'm sorry. So you go back here and look at this. These are pretty fast growing religions as of late. I mean, Mormonism, they claim they're the fastest growing major religion. And by the way, Mormons are not Christians. They're the fourth Abrahamic religion. I mean, think about it. They actually make that claim. But lately they've been trying to hide as a Christian. They're not Christians. I mean, how many Christians believe that God Golob has his own planet and makes and rules from that planet? That's the Yahweh. They don't call him Yahweh. They call him Kolob or something like that. So, that's not Christian. They use the word Jesus and Christ and all that bullshit, but there's nothing about. I mean, Jesus had 3 wives. How many of you guys do you know that Jesus had 3 wives? Well, they don't mention that in the New Testament. Conveniently, they leave that part. But Joseph Smith figured it out. So, yeah. So the fastest growing religions are also the most guilty. We ask a simple question: when religious, were you guilty about a specific activity or desire? And what we found was, if you were raised in a very religious home, you said yes 79% of the time. If you were raised in a very non-religious home, you said yes 26% of the time. Now, the interesting thing about non-religious homes is, even at that, we're seeing the effects of probably the religious sexual culture around us. Then it's not because their parents weren't religious, and parents that aren't religious generally aren't that sexually guilty. But we're still seeing the impact of it. Oh, excuse me. So, does religious guilt prevent or stop behavior? The theory, according to the religionists, is you need to feel guilty about your behavior and then you won't do it. So Mormons spend a lot of time teaching boys to be guilty about masturbating, and then of course they won't do it. We understand that theory pretty well. It works perfectly, right, for the Mormons? Let's look at how it works. Well, what we're going to do here, this is kind of complicated, but I'm going to go through it rather in some detail. What we're doing here is we're splitting the 10,000 up. And we're saying, if you evaluated your religiosity at home when you were growing up, a 1, 2, or a 3, a very, very low religiosity, or a 8, 9, or a 10, we're putting those in this group up here. The middle, we're dropping out. We're ignoring those. We want to see what the extremes of guilt look like. Now, the pattern would be the same if we included everybody, but you kind of have to do a dividing line. So what we've done is we say, if you were raised in a very religious environment at age 15, a non-religious environment age 15, when did you first start masturbating? Well, very religious people, 83% had started masturbating by age 15. Non-religious, 86.7% by age 15. Do you see a whole lot of difference there? There's no difference. Abstinence-only training, all this Eris research, I mean, there's so many pieces of research show that there's not any real difference. You can be really religious or really non-religious. You're going to start masturbating at about the same time. Petting. Now, for those of you who are young, you don't know what petting is. I've had this question. I go to college, university campuses, and I use this, and people ask me, what is petting? All right. If you don't know what petting is, people my age know it because we did it. It's everything short of actually putting your penis in a vagina. That's, or whatever else, if you're not into the pro side, if you're homosexual. So it's just kissing and petting and fondling and all that sort of stuff. So we can see that the religious, 43.7, 47.9, so a little bit of difference there. Oral sex. When did you first start having oral sex? 18.6% of our religious kids are sucking somebody's pussy or cock at age 15, and 20% of the non-religious. Not much difference there. When did you start having sexual intercourse? Look at this. 16.1% are having intercourse by the time they're 15, and 17.8% of the non-religious. We're not seeing a lot of difference. Think of the hundreds of hours, hundreds of sermons, hundreds of Sunday school lessons that have gone into this religious group over here, and it's not having any measurable impact. None whatsoever. And, oh, by the way, billions of your tax dollars going into abstinence-only training that has zero or almost zero effect. Now look here, religious at 18, and we see there's not a whole lot of difference between these four. But the religious people are screwing somebody 53.1% of the time. And the non-religious are 62%. So you got about a 9% difference there. Maybe we're seeing the effects of religious guilt. But by 21, they're pretty much caught up. We're seeing all sorts, especially in the masturbation stuff here. You know, they're all masturbating. Remember, Albert Ellis said 97% of men masturbate, the other 3% are lying. We're getting close to Albert Ellis's right there. So it's pretty clear. Look, there's just not that much difference, especially in the major sexual activity of oral sex and intercourse. These groups are very, very close together. Now, this is information. The abstinence only, the Baptists, the Catholics, they don't want to see this kind of stuff. And our research has been criticized because we only looked at one segment of the population, and we got most of our sample through through atheist blogs, and our samples really skewed towards younger people. You know, I confessed all that. Can you imagine doing a random survey? Can you imagine some phone surveyor picking up the phone and a Baptist on the other end answers and say, we'd like to do a sex survey with you. When did you start masturbating? Click. You can't do random surveys with sexuality. It just doesn't work that way. So we're just looking at something very interesting. We're looking at human beings. It doesn't matter if you're a Baptist or you're an atheist. It doesn't matter if you're a Catholic or a Muslim. You're going to start activity at roughly the same time. Other research confirms that, and look at this. Our research shows it as well. So it really doesn't matter that we didn't get any Baptists in here, because you know what? Most of these people raised in very religious environments, they didn't know they were going to be an atheist by age 25. They didn't know they were going to be an atheist or an agnostic by the age 50. When they're answering us how they were raised in a very religious home environment. So it's really a red herring in terms of our criticism of our particular research. I don't have time for a lot of questions, or we'll be here till 3 o'clock this afternoon, which would be fine with me, but I will entertain, if it's really important, throw it out. No, I'm not. I got 5 questions. No, can't do it. Let me just keep going, guys. I'll answer all the questions you want afterwards. But if I get stopped here, I won't go too far. So we thank our Heavenly Father for the closeted Southern hypocrites, of course. And because if it weren't for them, Mitt probably wouldn't even have a prayer for the thing. I think, isn't that interesting? The highest gay sex search, porn search. So let's look at where you get your sexual information from, and that'll relate back to that previous slide. We asked people, where'd you get your education, where the information come from? And we're also looking again at the guilt cycle. Does religious guilt slow people down or stop people from using certain kinds of religious of information that's in our culture? And what we did was we're going to look at the least religious here of our sample, and we're going to look at things like where'd you get your information from? 75% of the least religious raised kids said they got their information from friends. That's not a surprise. Nobody would disagree. That's certainly where I got a lot of mine. But the second is experience. Non-religious kids said they actually get in the back seat of a car and start doing it 42.4% of the time. Parents. I got my sexual education from my parents, 38%. Now, I don't know about you, but that looks piss poor. 38% of non-religious kids are getting their education from their parents. Now, you could answer up to 3. We had all these options here. You could answer up to 3. That's why it's going to add up to more than 100%. And then next to is internet and pornography. Now, I want you to remember these numbers right here, because these are the least religious kids. And our hypothesis is that guilt doesn't impact this kind of behavior. That's our hypothesis. Let's look at what the most religious kids are doing. Most religious kids are 70% get their information from friends. 50% get it by actually getting in the back seat of a car and doing it. 50%. They're screwing somebody. They're having oral sex. They're doing things sexually. Remember in the previous slide, it was 42% for the non-religious. The religious kids are actually doing more of it than the non-religious kids are. Pornography. You remember the previous slide? It was like 24%. Religious kids are getting their sexual information from pornography 33% of the time. Now, how many times has that child been told pornography will kill you, pornography will make you sick, pornography will ruin your marriage? I mean, over and over again, you get those kind of messages from your religion, and ain't doing a whole lot of good. They're still getting a lot of their sexual information from pornography. And then, of course, 31% just from the internet in general. Look at this one, though. Parents. Religious kids get their sexual information from parents 13.5% of the time. Now, you saw the previous slide with 38% for the less religious. This is horrible. I thought 38% was pretty piss poor, but 13%. So the nice thing about the way we designed this research is almost every question allowed you to make comments. We had 4,000 pages of comments. We still haven't read all this stuff, but there's some funny stories in there. I'll come back and talk a few of them. There's some really interesting stuff and some tragic stuff as well. But so we went in and we looked at the comments of these 13.5%. If they said they got their sex education from their parents, but they were raised in a very religious environment. And what we found was, yeah, their parents were talking to them about sex. Their parents were saying condoms don't work. Condoms cause disease. Don't look at pornography, it'll ruin your marriage. So they were getting a type of education, but it was piss poor, it was, non-evidence based, non-scientific. So we can see that experience, porn, and parents. And you would hope that would not be the case if kids are really getting good information. Those aren't exactly the best places to be getting information. And parents should be participating much more. They're not. So there was a large study by the University of Georgia in 2011 that shows that the states with the strongest policy and budget emphasis on abstinence-only education also have the highest sexually transmitted infections and teen pregnancies. This is true even after controlling for socioeconomic status, education, and other variables. Remember, our hypothesis was that religious guilt stops this behavior. We now have evidence that religious guilt actually increases this behavior and the guilt cycle. Now, why would religions harp on this so much? Because they're really not concerned about you having too much sex. They're not concerned about you masturbating. They're not concerned about you getting a disease, because if any of those things happen, then they can say, well, it's God's punishment for you. You've got to come back to our church to get forgiveness. It essentially traps people in the process. If you got pregnant out of wedlock, out of marriage, and you're a Baptist, you're guilty, and you better come back to church, and you better read your Bible. And you better bring that kid up so they don't do it too. And of course, you bring your kid up. And the highest probability of having a child out of wedlock is having a parent who had a child out of wedlock. I mean, it's a pretty strong predictor. And of course, we see here, this is independent research, has nothing to do with us. But it shows the same thing our research shows. Religious kids are doing it more and doing dangerous things more. So, if we found conclusive evidence that there was a drug on the market that was causing more disease than it cured, the FDA would pull that thing in a heartbeat. And yet billions of your tax dollars are going into teaching children abstinence-only education. And we have concrete, beyond a shadow of a doubt, evidence it actually causes children to behave in ways that are harmful to them. Kids, teenagers, having babies, having pregnancies, having sexually transmitted diseases, taking risks without proper protection. So we do have the conclusive evidence, but we're not getting, the tax dollars are still flowing to the religious side. In fact, $250 million just this last year, and I think evidence-based, science-based sex education got less than $100 million last year. So abstinence-only training, even under Obama, has continued to thrive. There's lots of your tax dollars going there. So let's look at a different aspect. Now that you're non-religious, how has your sex life changed? Now we're going to test the hypothesis around sex actually improves when you get rid of religion. And after we released the survey, I got a flood of emails from people who'd taken the survey saying thanks for releasing the results and giving us more information. Oftentimes, this gal sent me this particular one, and I thought it was pretty interesting. She has a big smile on her face, obviously. So, how has your sex life changed since you left religion? 54.6% of our respondents said their sex life change was an 8, 9, or a 10. As good as you can get. Now, a large sample here, around something less than 30%, said it hadn't changed at all. If they put a 5, then that means about the same. There's probably a bunch of Unitarians left church. Down here we had 2.2. Almost nobody said their sex life got worse after they left religion. Except down here we had 2.2%. And I was curious as hell about who are these people? And so we looked again, we looked at their comments. And we got some tragic comments, and we got some funny comments. One of the tragedies was a guy said, I told my wife, I finally confessed to my wife, I'm an atheist, I'm not going back to church with her. And she said, well, I can't go to bed with somebody who doesn't share my faith. So, no more nookie. Another guy wrote, he's like a 26-year-old guy, he said, I used to be able to lay every girl in the Sunday school class, and now they won't talk to me anymore. Those good Christian girls, they'll go to bed with you as long as you're a Christian. So it's really interesting how this worked out over here. Those people, the primary issue here wasn't that as much their sex life got worse as access. They lost access to a sex partner. It happened to women too, but not nearly as often as it happened to men. After religion, how has your sex life improved? By denomination. So depending upon what denomination you were raised, or religion, we can tell how much guilt you lost, if you will. And look at down here. The Jehovah's Witnesses take the cake there, but Mennonites and Mormons are just behind them. So again, we see this cult group, Pentecostal Seventh-Days, and those 5 right there. That's how much your sex life improved. You're averaging an 8.0 or more if you were raised as a Mormon. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but Mormons, does that sound right? Okay, you're not raising your hand, so hopefully I'm not too far off. Well, here's an interesting thing. Atheists, agnostics, remember this is kind of our baseline. You would expect that to not be anywhere because they weren't religion in the first place, so they're pretty much a 5. But the Unitarians are right there with us. Unitarians are about as unguilty as atheists and agnostics. I don't know about you, but you go to a Unitarian church, they're all atheists. They just won't admit it sometimes. And, of course, Jews. We got a lot of Reformed Jews, very liberal Jews, people raised in pretty much secular homes, saying, well, yeah, they finally left the temple, but didn't make much difference to them. We got some Buddhists, pagan. I thought this was interesting. In the Wicca pagan, now, again, it's not a very big sample. We only got about 35 or 40 people in that area. But they said they experienced guilt as a pagan or as a Wicca. And to me, I see pagans and Wiccas pretty liberated sexually. But our research shows there's still some guilt there. And actually, I know there is because I know a lot of pagans. I know some Wiccas. And there is some guilt there. There are some prohibitions. There are some restrictions around how they express their sexuality. So that's probably generally true. So that's how much improvement. So the main thing is if you are a Jehovah's Witness, if you're a Mormon, if you're a Seventh-day Adventist, you're a Pentecostal, you want to improve your sex life, get the hell out of church. It will really help you a lot. What is normal among seculars? Now we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to stop just looking at religious and say, okay, what about us as secularists? What's normal among us? And we're saying, so the first question is, we're going to look at women here for a little bit. Where do you get your sexual entertainment? Now, how many of you ladies are reading 50 Shades of Grey right now or have read it? So, nobody's admitting it? Oh, okay. 2 or 3. My girlfriend's reading it right now. She says it's really terribly written and they don't know diddly squat about BDSM. But, so as that be. All right, so where do women like erotic novels? 49.5% of the time. And I'm thinking 50 Shades of Grey fits in that. Does it?
Well, I actually started it yesterday. I read about like 10 pages.
Oh, well, we don't count you. How about somebody who's actually read it? Anybody else actually read it yet? Oh, come on. You guys, you're not into it? Okay, there's a guy back there. I can't. So, women like erotic novels. Women like DVDs with a plot. Okay? Naked bodies, but it's got a plot to it. Women like pictures. 40% of our respondents said they liked pictures. 36.5% of the women liked internet shorts. Now, I don't know if you know what internet shorts are. You know, they're just like 10-minute clips, enough to get off and get back to work. So that's women. Those are the top 4 for women. Again, you could give up to 3 of these, so that's why it's going to add up to more than 100%. 24% of our sample said they do not like pornography, of the women. And of course, we had other things like internet and so forth. Let's look at men. What types of pornography do you like? Where do you get your sexual entertainment? Men said, number 1, internet shorts. Now, remember the previous? If you just take the women's preferences and reverse them, that's what you get for the men. Women had that number 4. This is number 1 here. Guys want to get off and get back to work. The pictures. Men like the pictures almost as much as the movies. DVDs with a plot. Men don't have to wait for the plot. But 61% of them said, yeah, okay, they'll deal with the plot if they have to. Look at this. Number 1 was erotic novels for women. Look at that. Number 4 for men. Men don't read. That's just that. It's pretty clear there. Magazines, what else I got? I don't know. Anyways, so those were the top 4 for men. Humans love pornography. I keep getting these questions about, well, what about pornography? What about porn addiction? All this sort of stuff. Well, pornography is like masturbation. You're going to use it, you're going to do it, you're going to masturbate to it. It's just a part of it. And we've been doing it for a few tens of thousands of years, probably. We've even got figurines that look pretty darn pornographic. They're 20,000 years old. So this whole idea that pornography is somehow bad, I think is a red herring. And it's slipped under the radar. Because I think some secularists are really upset about it. So I think we really need to look, how do humans behave, and stop letting the religionists inform us. I'm not saying there's not problems with pornography. I do think there's problems in the way it's, in the treatment of people, and sometimes it's sex slavery and that sort of stuff. But just the concept of it and the use of it, we're human beings. We're going to use it, and you can't stop it. So don't try. It's just you're plugging a dam with 50 holes in it in one finger. So, is there a difference between when you begin? We're going to go back now and look at the guilty side. Is there a difference in the time you begin using pornography? Because most religions teach against and against and against pornography, just like they teach against premarital sex and masturbation. So now we're going to look at the most and least religious in our group. Were you religious? 1, 2, 3, or 8, 9, or 10? And we'll see that first, porn use by religiosity. And the least religious are blue, the most religious are red. So we can see at age 12, 9 to 12, the blue, least religious, are using pornography at the rate of 22.9. The religious are using pornography at 18.9%, 5%. So there is some difference here. That may be religious guilt. It may also be access. I don't know. I didn't know. I had no access to any pornography until I discovered it. And my dad was an elder in the church, and I discovered it in the lower left-hand corner of his dresser. So that was my first access to pornography, and I'm really grateful to my father for having that there. Otherwise, I'd have probably gone another year without any access to it. He tried to hide it. After he kind of figured out we knew where it was, he put it in a different spot. We found it. I have 4 brothers. No sisters, 4 brothers. We can find anything if it's got pornography. Years later, 2 or 3 years later, of course, we started our own collections. We had all 4 of us had my brother David, who's the third. I'm the oldest. My brother Dave. He had the best collection by far, and it was partly because Mom could never find where he kept it, so he was able to accumulate. And we all knew where each other's stash was, but we were strictly, you put it back and you don't let Mom know. Well, she finally found it. It was underneath the rabbit nest in the rabbit hutch. I mean, she went ballistic on us, and she threw that out. So we had to find even more places. All right, so you can see here, we were raised very, very religious. My parents became missionaries when they retired. But they also had pornography from as long as I can remember, early as I can remember. And so did several of the other elders in our church. Because we, guys, we'll compare notes. Does your dad have some? Yeah, my dad has some. Let's swap, let's look at each other. So that was my first introduction to BDSM pornography. Was another church elder's son showed me, somebody being tied up. That was really interesting. So look at this. By age 16, we see the religious have not only caught up, but they're exceeding us in use of porn. And by age 19, 20, 21, they're equal to or higher than us. Religious kids are using porn just as much as we do. We just don't feel as guilty about it once we start, if we're non-religious. So other research, as I've mentioned, several different research pieces today. But there's other research that really supports everything we found. We found a lot of cool, interesting things. But I think the thing we really found most interesting was that our research didn't find anything interesting. You can find some of what we found in the Eris research. You can find it in the Abstinence Only, paid with your tax dollars. You can find it in A Billion Wicked Thoughts. It's an interesting book that came out last year on internet porn searches by two computer science kind of guys, and they're able to look at, I think they got two different adult websites to allow them to look at the search engine stuff, and it's really an interesting book. The Barna research, George Barna out here in California is a very fundamentalist evangelical religious, he's like the Gallup poll for religion. And George Barna has found no difference among religionists in the use of pornography and non-religious. And the Guttmaker Institute, over and over again, the Guttmaker's got half a dozen different major pieces of research in the last 10 or 12 years, and they found no difference either. So we're focusing only on non-religious in large measure, but most of us, something like 70% of us who took this survey, were religious at one time. We were surprised at how many people were Sunday school teachers, how many people went to Bible colleges, how many people were actually ministers. And we're seeing that like in the Clergy Project. There's just lots and lots of people in our survey that were very dedicated, very religious. They knew the Bible, they taught the Bible, they attended religious conventions and all that sort of stuff. So you can't use the no true Scotsman with our research. The people who said they were religious, 8, 9, or a 10, they were as religious as anybody on this planet. And they gave it their best shot, and somehow it didn't work for them, and they moved on. Now, that's not to say there's not some selection going on, because I think there's some genetic, as I talk about in my book, Sex and God, I think there's some genetic aspects to religiosity. And there's some evidence that genes have an impact on people's religious tendencies. But that religious tendency there's no Christian gene, and there's no Muslim gene. If you have a tendency towards religiosity, you're going to pick up whatever it is that's in your particular environment. And that's, I think, what's going on in some cases. Here's some comments from some of our respondents. After leaving religion, I'm not afraid to have sex now. I don't feel guilty about masturbating, and I don't feel bad anymore about having sucked my friend's cock. On a side note, I would like to mention he was the preacher's son at the church I was attending. Here's a tragic one. There was a large space of time between becoming sexually active and becoming non-religious. During that time, I put myself at unnecessary risk of disease and pregnancy. While I was religious, guilt kept me from taking basic precautions like birth control or condom use. To me, using any sort of contraceptive was tantamount to admitting I was planning for and indeed desirous of sexual activities. Deciding not to use contraception allowed me to convince myself that my pleasure was a side effect of fulfilling my boyfriend's desire for sexual activity. This woman, in her letter to us, in her comments to us, virtually summarized the abstinence-only research. Abstinence-only research shows that kids taught abstinence-only don't take precautions, do get sexually transmitted disease, don't use condoms, believe condoms cause disease. I mean, all this stuff they're being taught, they actually believe it, and it impacts their behavior, as you can see here. Now, she didn't get pregnant, evidently she didn't get a disease, but she could have, and that's the problem with abstinence-only training. So, within our sample, there's growing evidence that if you leave religion, you're going to have a bump in your sex life, a positive bump. Another thing we found was if you want to have a good sex life, Do not marry a religious person, period. I talk about this at some length in Sex and God. I talk about the Jesus trap. And you may have seen, if you've seen the book, you may have seen this in your own life. You may have seen it in other people's. How many of you know people who are fairly secular and they fell in love with a religious person? Before you know it, they become religious fanatics themselves. How many of you know some? Yeah, right. That's the Jesus trap in its most insidious manifestation. If you are going to marry a religious person, marry a Unitarian. Marry an Episcopalian, but don't get a Baptist. Don't get a Catholic. You'll get all that guilt that we've seen. We also found that a spouse's religiosity had a direct impact on your sexual satisfaction. We asked, how religious is your spouse at this moment? If you're married, how religious is your spouse? And if you said, I'm an atheist, my spouse is religious, 8, 9, or a 10, then you had a 76% chance of saying you have a lousy sex life. So if your spouse is highly religious and you're an atheist, you're not getting much at this point in time. So the more religious your sex life, your spouse is, the less satisfied you are. So there's a very strong correlation. We found a very strong correlation between that. There's actually an inverse relationship between spousal religiosity and sexual satisfaction. We also can say that sexual guilt does not change behavior. It can cause you to express that drive or desire in inappropriate times and places, which we've already seen in the way children, abstinence only, and the other things we've talked about earlier. The bottom line that we can gather from all this research is biology happens. You're a human being. I don't care if you're a Baptist human being or a Catholic human being. You're going to start having sex. And because religions ignore the biology, they also cause greater problems and great harm in humans. I think religion causes more harm to our sexual lives than we ever imagined. And even if you're an atheist, I think you probably have been affected negatively and you may not even know it. Here's a quote. I want you to remember this quote. You can take religion out of sex, but you cannot take sex out of religion. Think about it. Do you think we're ever going to see the day the Pope wakes up one morning and says, wow, I had the best wet dream last night. I think we'll make masturbation legal. Or do you think Ted Haggard's saying, man, screwing that homosexual gay guy, a prostitute, was a lot of fun. I think we'll make homosexuality legal in the evangelical church. No, you're not going to get that because sex has become such an important component to the guilt cycle. You know, not eating pork just doesn't work as well. Not eating fish on Friday doesn't work as well. And religions, believe me, they've tried all sorts of things to keep you trapped. But sex keeps you trapped better than anything else. That's why I think this research on sex and the concept of the guilt cycle is so important. I've never seen anybody else explore this idea. I see lots of people debating, why is religion so powerful? But nobody really looks at the guilt and shame part of it. And I go into great detail about how guilt and shame cause so much problems in human sexuality. So sex is religion's weak spot, and I'm going to give you some tips here today on how we can start communicating with religionists. Because I think we should be challenging. I don't care if you debate somebody, whether God exists or not. You're not going to win that debate. So, I mean, how many of you debated a bunch of religious? Yeah, how many of you won the debate? Yeah, it doesn't work too often, does it? So I say, stop doing it. So you say, well, Darrel, I'm not religious. What's all this have to do with me? Well, I'm going to say that you are not religious, maybe, but you're in this religiously polluted environment. And a fish swimming in polluted water is ingesting the pollution. You're ingesting the pollution right here. You can't not look at the front page and see some sexual message that sex is wrong, sex is shameful. You know, some politician gets caught with his hands down and everybody comes out, or you know, the recent tragedy in Colorado. You see idiots coming out of the woodwork talking about, you know, how this is a sign of teaching our children bad values and all that sort of stuff. So I think many of us are infected with the God virus sexually. If you experience guilt or shame in any way around your sexuality, you're probably infected in some way. So here, you remember, you know Jeff Foxworthy? You might be a redneck if. Well, I'm going to give you something a little bit different here. You might be a Christian atheist if we act like Christians. We hide our sexuality. We pretend or we don't that we don't do stuff that we really do. We let religions condemn us, and we do things like, feel ashamed for going to the porn shop. This is really interesting. A good Christian friend of mine who just started dating an atheist, and she is liberating him in some ways. And recently I found out that he had taken his first trip to the porn shop to get some toys. I'm thinking, praise the flying spaghetti monster. This is great. So the Christians really play upon this guilt thing, trying to make you feel guilty about going in there. But, the elders went in there and got it themselves, or the minister went in there and got it themselves. So let's get back to the redneck thing. You might be a Christian atheist. Instead of a redneck, you might be a Christian atheist if you feel guilty about masturbating. You might be a Christian atheist if you feel shame admitting you like porn. You might be a Christian atheist if you have difficulty talking to your children about sex and sexuality. You might be a Christian atheist if you have difficulty talking to your spouse or partner about sexual fantasies you would like to try. You might be a Christian atheist if you feel disgust around normal sexual activities. So like I said earlier, sex is religion's weak spot. We need to challenge that. And we need to be out about our sexuality, and we need to support others in their openness about their sexuality. I love the gay community, and I love them because they are out there in front. They're not letting anybody intimidate them any longer. But yet I see atheists. If we were in a church, and you happen to be in that church, and I said, how many of you masturbate? I'll bet some of the atheists wouldn't raise their hand because you don't want to be seen as different. Well, I think we need to start challenging that very idea in many ways. So, here's some ways to do it. You could say to somebody in a talk about sex, sure, I fornicate, just like a lot of religious people do. The problem with that would be, sure, I masturbate. Don't you? Sure, I enjoy pornography, just like most religious people. They just can't admit it. And we have lots of evidence for that. Mississippi and Utah. Or frame their behavior. Control of women's bodies is what religious sexuality is all about. We need to challenge this behavior, and here's one way to challenge it. We could say, I take birth control because I like sex outside of marriage, just like Newt Gingrich and Rush Limbaugh. If you frame it that way, it really puts a different focus on it. It takes the focus off of your, quote, immorality and puts the focus on their lying and their inability to admit what's actually going on. So ask questions. Did you know that 95% of all Americans have premarital sex? This goes back to the 1950s. We've got research that shows consistently 95% of Americans have premarital sex. The 5% that don't are Catholic priests, nuns, and Baptist ministers. And if you believe that, I got a bridge to sell you on top of that. Do you think your minister used condoms when he had 2 girlfriends in Bible college? Not just a question, I just wonder. Does your priest masturbate, or do you think your priest uses porn? I just wonder. How would you know if he did or didn't? He's preaching to you about not using it. Well, here's a theological question. Are there souls and zygotes? Which zygotes get the souls? For every live birth, a woman has several zygotes that never implant and grow. Do they go to heaven or hell? Let's get into some theological discussions with these crazy anti-abortion people. So here's some secular advice. There are 7 billion people on this planet, and we're on our way to 9 billion, unfortunately. We need to start thinking of sex as fun, with sex as bonding. Sex is not for reproduction. And there's a large number of people on this planet that don't even want to reproduce. There's lots of people who say, I don't want children. So what is sex for? According to the religionists, it's for reproduction. You shouldn't be having it if you're a Catholic unless you're planning on having babies. So as secularists, we need to challenge this whole idea, and it's not bound together. Reproduction and sex need to be separated. In Sex and God, I talk a lot about the evidence that humans... How many of you typed on a computer in the last day or two? Okay, look at that. Almost everybody. Your hands were not made for typing on a computer. We have repurposed our hands to do other things. Well, that's what the humans have done with sex. We have repurposed sex. Most organisms on this planet only have sex for reproduction. That's the way your dog does it. That's the way insects do it. Humans don't. We have sex for fun. We have sex for bonding, mating. So it's very different. We are not in it for the reproduction only. So sex is fun. So is drinking. So let's do both responsibly, and let's teach our children how to have them behave responsibly. As rationalists, we have no one looking over our shoulders. If we hurt somebody, we can't pray to Jesus and get forgiveness. We have knowledge, and we have the ability to make good decisions, and we can have fun while we're doing it. We're responsible for our actions. There's no one to forgive us. And that's the bottom line. I think we're less guilty. We can enjoy sex a hell of a lot more, but we're also more responsible because we know that condoms work. We know that how sexually transmitted diseases come, and we can teach other people, and we can challenge religions, we can challenge legislators, we can challenge politicians to teach science-based education and give them the evidence, push the evidence, question them, and don't let them get by with some of the shoddy stuff they've been doing. Thanks a lot. I've appreciated your attention here today. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, right. Could I do an unpaid political announcement real quick?
Yeah.
30 seconds. For those of you, I don't know, how many of you know about recovering from religion? Oh, good. A lot of you do. Well, I founded this group 3 years ago, and it's grown from a few meetings to almost 200 meetings throughout the world. I like to always encourage you, if you're interested, go online, look, recoveringfromreligion.org, and start a group. We could use groups all over the nation. We've only got one group in San Diego. I don't think we've got any here in Los Angeles right now. But it's groups of people leaving religion. And if you think about it, you come to Atheists United, most of us have been there, done that. We don't want to hear somebody's story about how to deal with their religious mother-in-law. So, recovering from religion is a way to give people a safe place to come and listen and talk to each other. And it's like Alcoholics Anonymous for religionists, except we only need 10 steps. When you take God out of it, you only need 10 steps. So recovering from religion is not a competition. It does not compete with any other atheist group. What we found all across the nation is it brings people into the movement. People won't leave a church and come straight into Atheists United. That's very rare. What they will do is leave a church, find recovering from religion for 3 or 4 or 5 months, find out that atheists don't eat babies in the morning, and then move on to Atheists United. So I'm encouraging every organization, Atheists United, you should have a recovering from religion group associated with you, so you'll be getting more members through. It brings people in. We get on average in Kansas City 2 to 3 new members every month in our free thought groups that come straight through recovering from religion. It's a great recruiting tool. But we're not there to recruit. We don't push anything. We don't push atheism on anybody. We're just there to listen to your story. And Dave Ohio emailed me the other day and said, we had our second meeting, 5 people showed up. We'd scheduled for an hour and a half, and 3 hours later, the coffee shop was kicking us out. I mean, that's how cathartic it can be to have somebody listen to you for the first time. And that's what recovering from religion is all about. The second thing I want to highlight is our therapist project. How many have heard of the Secular Therapist Project? Oh, not very many of you. Get online. Look at seculartherapy.org. We're trying to find secular psychotherapists. Imagine a psychotherapist that announces they're atheist will lose half of their clients overnight. And ministers and priests and churches will stop referring to it. So a psychologist cannot say out loud, I'm a secular, I'm an atheist. So what we've done is we're putting a Match.com or an eHarmony type site together where people can communicate with an atheist psychologist, or a secularist anyway, privately. And nobody knows. You can't find their name out, they can't find yours out. You can just plug in your zip code and find out if there's a secular therapist near you. But we need more therapists. We have 46 registered. We want 200 by the end of the year. We have almost 400 clients registered. Get online. Register as a client if you're looking for a secular therapist. If there's nobody close to you, then you can just plug it in, look, and find a therapist that'll talk to you on the phone, or they'll talk to you on Skype. Mental health services for atheists are hard to come by. It's hard to find a secular therapist. because they can't advertise. And you'll end up getting some Catholic with a crucifix in their office, or you get a Baptist who was trained at Jerry Falwell University. You know, you can't tell whether somebody's secular or not just by looking at the yellow pages. All right, that's all. I'm going to get out of your way. Thanks, guys. Yeah.